October 15th, 1944, Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Tokyo. Commander Toshikazu Ohmae sat in a dimly lit office, reviewing the latest intelligence reports from the Philippines. As a staff officer in the Naval General Staff, Ohmae had access to information that most Japanese citizens would never see. On his desk lay a document that would have seemed impossible just 3 years earlier. It was a list of American aircraft carriers currently operational in the Pacific. His hand trembled slightly as he counted: Essex, Intrepid, Hornet, Lexington. The names went on and on. Fast carriers, light carriers, escort carriers, ships that had been launched within the last 18 months, many within the last 6 months. Ships that represented a level of industrial production that defied everything Japanese naval planning had assumed possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ohmae pulled out another document, one he had helped compile. It listed every aircraft carrier the Imperial Japanese Navy had commissioned since the Washington Naval Treaty expired in 1936. He counted them again, though he knew the number by heart. 12 fleet carriers, 12 ships built over 8 years, representing the absolute maximum effort of Japanese shipbuilding capacity. Then he looked back at the American list. The number was staggering. Impossible, terrifying. The Americans had built 141 carriers by the time Japan stopped being able to accurately count them in late 1944, and the intelligence reports suggested they were still building more, that production had not even slowed, that new carriers were sliding down the ways every few weeks. Ohmae later wrote in his memoirs that this was the moment he understood with absolute clarity that Japan had lost the war. Not because of any single battle or tactical failure, but because the fundamental premise of Japanese strategy had been based on a catastrophic miscalculation. Japan had assumed that America, while industrially powerful, could not translate that industrial capacity into sustained military production fast enough to matter. They had assumed the war would be decided by the initial balance of forces, by superior training and tactics, by spiritual determination overcoming material disadvantages. The carrier production numbers proved all of those assumptions fatally wrong. This was not a war that would be decided by warrior spirit or tactical brilliance. This was a war of production lines, of welding torches, of industrial capacity measured in millions of tons of steel. And in that war, Japan had already lost before the first shot was fired at Pearl Harbor. The story of how Japan built 12 carriers in 8 years, while America built 141 in less time, is not simply a tale of industrial disparity. It is the story of two nations with fundamentally different approaches to modern warfare, of strategic assumptions that proved disastrously wrong, and of the moment when Japanese leadership realized they were fighting an enemy whose productive capacity exceeded their most pessimistic projections by orders of magnitude. The Japanese carrier program began in the 1920s with the conversion of the battle cruiser Akagi and the battleship Kaga into aircraft carriers following the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. These conversions, completed in the late 20s and early 30s, gave Japan 2 large fleet carriers that formed the foundation of naval aviation doctrine. They were followed by purpose-built carriers, Ryujo, Soryu, and Hiryu in the 1930s. By 1941, when Japan entered the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed 10 aircraft carriers of various types. 6 of these were fleet carriers, capable of operating with the battle fleet: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. The remaining 4 were smaller carriers used for training and secondary operations. This carrier force represented 20 years of development, the cream of Japanese naval aviation, and the most experienced carrier air groups in the world. Japanese naval planners understood that carriers would be decisive in any Pacific war. They had studied carrier operations extensively, developed sophisticated doctrine for carrier task force operations, and trained their pilots to standards that exceeded any other navy. The 6 fleet carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, represented the most powerful concentration of naval aviation the world had ever seen. But Japanese planning contained a fatal flaw. They assumed the war would be short. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, famously predicted that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but expressed deep pessimism about a prolonged conflict with America. The entire Japanese strategy depended on winning a decisive naval battle early in the war, destroying American will to fight, and securing a negotiated peace that would leave Japan dominant in East Asia. This strategic vision required maintaining carrier strength at roughly the level Japan possessed in December 1941. Japanese shipbuilding plans called for building new carriers to replace losses and gradually expand the fleet. Between 1936 and 1944, Japan completed 12 new fleet and light carriers: Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, Taiho, Shinano, Onryu, Amagi, Katsuragi, Junyo, Hyo, and Ryuho. Several more were under construction but never completed. This represented the absolute maximum output of Japanese heavy industry. Carriers required enormous amounts of steel, sophisticated machinery, armor plate, aviation fuel systems, and complex electronics. Japan's industrial base, while advanced by Asian standards, was a fraction of American capacity. Japanese planners knew this. What they failed to grasp was the sheer scale of disparity. American carrier construction before Pearl Harbor was limited by treaty restrictions and peacetime budgets. In 1941, the United States Navy possessed 7 aircraft carriers: Lexington, Saratoga, Ranger, Yorktown, Enterprise, Wasp, and Hornet. This was fewer than Japan's 10 carriers. American carriers were generally larger and more sophisticated, but the numbers seemed to favor Japan in the opening stages of war. What Japanese intelligence failed to appreciate was that American industrial capacity in peacetime bore almost no relationship to American industrial capacity at war. The United States in 1941 was not even fully mobilized. Major industries were still producing civilian goods. Shipyards were operating at a fraction of potential capacity. The vast inland industrial infrastructure had barely been touched by war production. When Congress passed the Two-Ocean Navy Act in July 1940, it authorized construction of 18 new aircraft carriers, along with hundreds of other ships. This was before America even entered the war. After Pearl Harbor, President Franklin Roosevelt called for production levels that seemed impossible even to American industrialists: 50,000 aircraft per year, millions of tons of shipping, and carriers, lots of carriers. The American carrier construction program operated on 3 parallel tracks, each representing a different compromise between capability and production speed. The Essex-class fleet carriers formed the backbone of the fast carrier task forces. These were large, sophisticated ships, displacing 30,000 tons, capable of operating 90 aircraft, with heavy anti-aircraft armament and excellent damage control systems. The first Essex-class carrier, USS Essex, was commissioned in December 1942, just 1 year after Pearl Harbor. What seemed like a reasonable construction time for a complex warship became terrifyingly efficient. Essex was followed by Yorktown in April 1943, then Intrepid, then Hornet, then Lexington. The names of ships lost in combat were immediately recycled onto new hulls. By the end of 1943, 8 Essex-class carriers were in service. By mid-1944, 17 were operational. The class would eventually include 24 ships, though some were completed too late to see combat. Each carrier represented approximately 21 months from keel laying to commissioning, an astonishing pace for such complex vessels. The second track was the Independence-class light carriers. These ships were built on cruiser hulls already under construction, converted during building to light aircraft carriers. The decision to build them represented American industrial philosophy at its most pragmatic. Rather than wait for purpose-built carriers, the Navy would accept slightly inferior designs if it meant getting more flight decks into combat faster. 9 Independence-class carriers were commissioned between January and December 1943. They were smaller than Essex-class ships, carrying only 30 to 35 aircraft, but they were fast and could operate with the fast carrier task forces. Their construction time averaged just 15 months from conversion decision to commissioning. The third and largest track was escort carrier production. These small carriers, built on merchant ship hulls, were designed to provide air cover for convoys, support amphibious landings, and conduct anti-submarine warfare. They could not keep up with fast carriers or operate in fleet actions, but they could be built quickly and in vast numbers. Escort carriers came from multiple programs. Some were converted merchant hulls. Others were purpose-built on simplified designs. The most prolific was the Casablanca class, where Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver, Washington, perfected mass production techniques borrowed from Liberty ship construction. Kaiser's methods were revolutionary. Rather than building ships in traditional ways, Kaiser broke construction down into prefabricated modules built inland, then transported to the shipyard for rapid assembly. Welding replaced riveting. Standardization eliminated custom work. The entire shipyard operated like an assembly line. The results were staggering. Kaiser launched 50 Casablanca-class escort carriers between April 1943 and June 1944, one carrier every 8 days on average. At peak efficiency, Kaiser was launching a new escort carrier every 5 days. The construction time from keel laying to commissioning averaged 90 days, 3 months from start to finish for a warship. These were not sophisticated vessels. They were slow, poorly armored, vulnerable to damage. Sailors called them Kaiser coffins, and combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. But they could launch aircraft, provide air cover, and most importantly, they could be built faster than Japan could sink them. By late 1944, when Commander Ohmae sat in Tokyo trying to count American carriers, the numbers had become absurd. The U.S. Navy had commissioned 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and approximately 115 escort carriers of various types. The total reached 141 carriers, and production was still accelerating. Japanese intelligence officers attempting to track American carrier construction faced an impossible task. New ships appeared in combat before Japanese intelligence even knew they had been launched. The names confused matters further. Americans recycled names from sunken ships immediately, so Japanese intelligence might report Lexington sunk, only to have Lexington appear in combat reports months later. Not realizing this was a different ship. The psychological impact of this revelation on Japanese naval leadership cannot be overstated. In May 1942, Japan had fought America to a tactical draw at the Battle of the Coral Sea, losing 1 light carrier while sinking 1 American fleet carrier. In June 1942, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers at Midway, while America lost 1. These seemed like losses that could be replaced, battles that were part of normal naval attrition. By late 1942, Japanese intelligence began receiving reports of new American carriers in the Pacific. This seemed reasonable. America had shipyards and industrial capacity. They would replace losses, just as Japan planned to replace losses. But the numbers kept growing, and the replacements kept coming faster. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated the disparity in the starkest possible terms. Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa led the Japanese mobile fleet with 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers, representing virtually every operational carrier Japan possessed. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded American Task Force 58 with 7 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, just one of several carrier task forces the U.S. Navy now operated. The battle was a massacre. Japanese aircraft were shot down in such numbers that American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. 2 Japanese carriers were sunk. American losses were minimal. But the strategic implication was worse than the tactical defeat. Admiral Ozawa had committed Japan's entire available carrier strength. Admiral Mitcher had committed less than half of American carrier strength in the Pacific. The disparity extended beyond hulls to every aspect of carrier operations. Japan struggled to replace lost aircraft. America was producing so many aircraft that newer, better models were constantly replacing older types. Japan could not adequately train replacement pilots. America had so many carriers operating as training vessels that new pilots received months of preparation before joining fleet carriers. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Japan faced critical shortages of aviation fuel, limiting training and operations. America produced aviation fuel in such quantities that routine training flights consumed more fuel than Japan's entire monthly production. Japanese carriers that survived battles often had to remain in port for months, awaiting repairs due to shipyard capacity limits and spare parts shortages. American carriers damaged in combat were repaired in weeks and returned to action. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 provided the final demonstration. Admiral Ozawa commanded 4 carriers, but they were essentially decoys, with minimal aircraft and poorly trained pilots. Their purpose was to lure American carriers away from the invasion beaches so Japanese battleships could attack the amphibious fleet. The plan required sacrificing Japan's remaining carriers. Ozawa succeeded tactically. American carriers pursued his force northward, sinking all 4 Japanese carriers. But strategically, the sacrifice was meaningless. The Japanese battleships failed to break through to the landing beaches, and America's carrier strength was barely dented. Within weeks, damaged American carriers were back in action. Japan's carriers were gone forever. By early 1945, Japan had no operational fleet carriers. The Americans were operating more than 30 fast carriers in multiple task forces simultaneously. Escort carriers provided air support for every amphibious landing. The disparity had become so overwhelming that Japanese strategy no longer contemplated carrier operations at all. The focus shifted to suicide attacks, to kamikaze aircraft launched from land bases, to beach defense, homeland protection. The reasons for this catastrophic production disparity were multiple and interconnected. American industrial capacity exceeded Japanese capacity by roughly 10-to-1 in steel production, 20-to-1 in oil production, and even larger margins in specialized manufacturing. But capacity alone does not explain the difference. Organization and methods mattered enormously. American shipbuilding adopted mass production techniques that would have seemed impossible in traditional shipyards. Henry Kaiser, who had never built ships before the war, applied assembly line methods from automobile manufacturing. His yards prefabricated entire sections of ships inland, transported them to the waterfront, and welded them together. Traditional shipbuilders insisted this was impossible. Kaiser proved them wrong. The American approach to carrier design emphasized standardization. Essex-class carriers were essentially identical, allowing production of components in multiple factories, interchangeable parts, and simplified training. Japanese carriers were often unique designs, each requiring custom components and specialized construction techniques. American welding technology and techniques proved superior to Japanese riveting methods. Welded hulls were faster to construct, stronger, and easier to repair. The United States trained hundreds of thousands of welders, including many women, in crash programs that turned civilians into skilled shipyard workers in weeks. Japan lacked both the training infrastructure and the cultural acceptance of female industrial workers. American raw material abundance contrasted starkly with Japanese shortages. The United States never faced meaningful shortages of steel, aluminum, copper, or other materials needed for ship construction. Japan struggled with every material. Aluminum was so scarce that aircraft manufacturers constantly compromised designs. Copper shortages affected electrical systems. Steel had to be rationed carefully between competing military and industrial needs. American logistics allowed materials from across the continent to flow to shipyards without interruption. Japanese logistics were constrained by limited shipping, submarine attacks, and inadequate rail infrastructure. Materials produced in Manchuria had to be shipped to Japan aboard merchant vessels that faced increasing losses to American submarines. By 1944, this supply chain was breaking down completely. The financial disparity was equally stark. The United States financed carrier construction through war bonds, taxation, and deficit spending that a strong economy could sustain. American GDP during the war years actually grew despite enormous military spending. Japan's economy was straining before the war began. Military spending consumed an ever larger share of a shrinking economic base. By 1944, Japanese civilians faced real hunger. Industrial production was declining. Yet military spending continued to increase, creating an unsustainable spiral. American carrier construction employed the most advanced technology available: radar systems, sophisticated damage control equipment, high-capacity aviation fuel systems, extensive anti-aircraft armament. These were all standard features on American carriers. Japanese carriers, even late-war designs like Taiho, could not match American technological sophistication because Japan lacked the industrial base to produce complex electronics and fire control systems in quantity. The human element was equally important. American shipyards employed millions of workers operating in multiple shifts. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. The famous Rosie the Riveter was not propaganda but reality. Shipyards operated 24 hours per day. Workers were well-fed, well-paid, and motivated by both patriotism and economic opportunity. Japanese shipyards struggled with labor shortages, inadequate food rations, and deteriorating working conditions. As the war progressed and American submarines decimated merchant shipping, raw materials arrived irregularly. Workers weakened by inadequate nutrition could not maintain productivity. Skilled workers were drafted into military service, leaving shipyards with less experienced crews. The strategic implications of carrier production disparity extended far beyond simple numbers. American carriers enabled a strategy that Japan could not counter. Fast carrier task forces provided air superiority wherever they appeared. Amphibious invasions could be conducted under carrier air cover against any target within range of Japan. The island-hopping campaign that systematically reduced Japanese defensive perimeter was possible only because America had enough carriers to support multiple simultaneous operations. Japan's inability to replace carrier losses meant each setback was permanent. After Midway, Japanese carrier strength never recovered. After the Philippine Sea, Japan's carrier aviation was effectively destroyed. By later Gulf, carriers were decoys because Japan had no trained pilots or aircraft to put on them. The strategic initiative passed permanently to America. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership was profound and shaped decisions throughout the war's final years. The realization that America could build carriers faster than Japan could sink them led to increasingly desperate strategies. Kamikaze attacks represented an acknowledgement that conventional naval aviation could no longer compete. The suicide tactics were wasteful and horrific, but they were also rational within the context of complete material inferiority. If you cannot match enemy production, you must find asymmetric methods that do not require production. Japanese officers who survived the war and were interviewed later consistently emphasized their shock at discovering the scale of American production. Many had studied in America before the war and understood American industrial capacity in abstract terms. But understanding that America could build more ships, and actually seeing those ships appear in combat in overwhelming numbers, were entirely different experiences. Admiral Ohmae, in his post-war memoirs, described showing the carrier production figures to senior officers in late 1944. Some refused to believe the numbers. Others accepted them but insisted that spiritual strength would prevail. A few grasped the full implications and understood the war was lost. But by then, Japanese military culture and political situation made surrender impossible. The war would continue until complete defeat. The carrier production disparity also revealed fundamental differences in how Japan and America approached industrial warfare. Japan treated shipbuilding as a craft, where skilled workers built complex vessels through traditional methods. America treated shipbuilding as manufacturing, where industrial processes could be optimized, standardized, and scaled. Neither approach was inherently superior, but when applied to total war mobilization, the American approach proved overwhelmingly more effective. Specific examples illustrated the gap. USS Essex, the first of its class, was commissioned in December 1942, 21 months after its keel was laid. This seemed like an achievement, but by 1944, Kaiser Shipyards was commissioning escort carriers 90 days after laying their keels. Japanese shipyards required approximately 2 years to build a fleet carrier, and escort carrier production remained limited and slow. The Casablanca-class carriers represented industrial efficiency taken to its logical conclusion. These ships were essentially identical. Workers could move between different hulls and find everything in the same place. Tools and techniques were standardized across the entire class. Prefabricated sections were built in factories far from the shipyard, then transported and assembled. The entire process resembled building automobiles more than traditional shipbuilding. Japanese shipyards never adopted such methods, partly because of tradition, partly because Japan lacked the inland industrial infrastructure to support distributed manufacturing, and partly because Japanese designs were less standardized. Each carrier had unique features reflecting lessons learned from previous ships. This made each vessel slightly better, but also made production slower and more complex. The final accounting was devastating. Japan completed 12 new carriers between 1936 and 1944. America completed 141 carriers between 1941 and 1944. Japan's entire carrier production over 8 years was exceeded by American production in approximately 6 months during peak output in 1944. By late 1944, when Japanese intelligence stopped trying to maintain accurate counts, America was still building carriers at full capacity. The Essex-class program continued with ships launching every few weeks. Escort carrier production remained at high levels. New light carrier classes were in development. The productive capacity showed no signs of slowing. Japan, meanwhile, had essentially ceased carrier construction. Resources were diverted to defensive positions, to kamikaze aircraft, to homeland defense preparations. The last Japanese carrier completed was Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, commissioned in November 1944. She was sunk by submarine 10 days later on her maiden voyage, having never conducted flight operations. The lessons from the carrier production race resonated far beyond World War II. They demonstrated that modern industrial warfare was decided by productive capacity as much as by tactical skill or warrior spirit. They proved that sustained military operations required industrial bases capable of replacing losses and maintaining supply. They showed that tactical victories were meaningless if strategic production disparities were too large to overcome. For Japan, the carrier production disparity became a symbol of the entire war's futility. Every aspect of the conflict eventually reflected the same pattern. Japan would fight with skill and determination. America would respond with overwhelming material superiority. Initial Japanese successes would be slowly ground down by industrial weight that could not be matched or countered. The human cost of this industrial disparity was measured in lives. Japanese naval aviators, among the best trained pilots in the world at the war's start, were systematically depleted. Each loss was irreplaceable. American naval aviation could lose pilots and aircraft in combat, then replace them with better trained pilots flying more advanced aircraft within weeks. By 1944, American carrier pilots had better training, more flight hours, and newer aircraft than Japanese pilots. The qualitative gap mirrored the quantitative gap. Japanese carrier crews who survived into late war battles described the experience of facing American carrier task forces with multiple carriers as psychologically devastating. They knew that even if they achieved perfect tactical execution, even if they sank multiple American ships, the strategic situation would not change. More American carriers would arrive. Japan had no more carriers to send. The final irony was that many American carriers completed late in the war never saw combat. They were commissioned, worked up, sailed toward the combat zone, and arrived after Japan surrendered. In peacetime, this would have been seen as waste. In the context of total war, it was terrifying evidence of productive excess. America built so many carriers that some never fired a shot in anger because the war ended before they could reach combat zones. Post-war analysis by both American and Japanese military historians identified the carrier production disparity as one of the clearest illustrations of why Japan lost the Pacific War. Japanese strategy required winning quickly before American industrial capacity could be fully mobilized. Every month the war continued, shifted the balance further toward America. By mid-1944, the balance had shifted so far that no tactical brilliance or strategic insight could have changed the outcome. For the Japanese officers who understood these numbers in real time, the knowledge was crushing. They had committed their nation to a war against an opponent whose industrial capacity exceeded their own by margins so large that victory was mathematically impossible in any prolonged conflict. The only question was how long Japan would continue fighting, and at what cost in lives. Commander Ohmae's moment of realization, sitting in Tokyo with carrier production lists, was repeated in various forms throughout Japanese military leadership. Some officers reached this understanding early and advocated for negotiated peace. Others never accepted it and insisted on fighting to the last. But the numbers were undeniable. 12 carriers in 8 years versus 141 carriers in 3 years. The disparity told the entire story of the Pacific War in 2 simple figures. The American public during the war knew that carriers were being built in large numbers, but most civilians probably did not grasp the full scale of production. News reports mentioned new carriers launching, but did not systematically compare Japanese and American output. The strategic implications were understood by military planners and senior political leadership, but the average American likely thought of the war as being fought more evenly than reality suggested. For Japan, the propaganda machinery worked to conceal the true situation from civilians. Reports emphasized Japanese victories and downplayed losses. The phrase strategic withdrawal appeared in news reports about operations that were actually defeats. Carrier losses were minimized or not reported at all. The Japanese public did not know until the war's end how thoroughly outmatched their military had become. The carrier production story also revealed the effectiveness of American strategic planning. The Two-Ocean Navy Act passed in 1940, before Pearl Harbor, authorized construction programs that would not reach fruition until 1943 and 1944. This required faith in American industrial capacity and willingness to commit resources based on future threats rather than immediate needs. The planning proved prescient. Japanese planning, by contrast, consistently underestimated both American capacity and American will. The assumption that America would sue for peace after initial defeats proved completely wrong. The belief that American industrial capacity could not be mobilized quickly enough to affect the war's outcome was catastrophically incorrect. These strategic miscalculations, rooted in cultural assumptions about American society, doomed Japan from the start. The end result was a naval war, where one side operated with effectively unlimited carrier capacity, while the other side saw carrier strength decline from the war's midpoint onward. By 1945, American carriers operated with impunity in Japanese home waters. Carrier aircraft struck Japanese cities, naval bases, industrial facilities. Japanese forces had no effective counter. The defensive strategy relied on land-based aircraft and suicide attacks, acknowledgements that conventional carrier operations were no longer possible. The legacy of the carrier production race influenced post-war military thinking and Cold War strategy. Both the United States and Soviet Union understood that sustained military competition required industrial bases capable of matching opponent production. The arms race that characterized the Cold War was ultimately a competition of industrial and technological capacity, lessons learned directly from World War II experiences. For historians studying the Pacific War, the carrier production numbers provide perhaps the clearest single metric for understanding why Japan lost. Other factors mattered: strategy, tactics, leadership, individual courage, and sacrifice. But ultimately, modern industrial warfare was decided by which side could produce more ships, aircraft, tanks, and ammunition. In that competition, Japan never had a chance. The 12 carriers Japan built in 8 years represented the maximum effort of a strained industrial economy. The 141 carriers America built in less time represented only a portion of American industrial capacity, built while simultaneously producing thousands of other ships, tens of thousands of aircraft, and supplying allies around the world. The gap was not merely quantitative but qualitative, revealing fundamentally different levels of industrial development and organizational capability. For Japanese naval officers like Commander Minoru Ohmae, an intelligent, thoughtful staff officer who had spent years analyzing American shipbuilding trends, the emerging reality was both liberating and terrible. Liberating because it finally explained the pattern that frontline commanders could feel but never fully quantify. Every new battle in the Central and South Pacific brought more American ships, not merely replacing losses but exceeding them by orders of magnitude. Task forces grew from dozens of ships to hundreds. Escort carriers appeared everywhere, protecting convoys, supporting amphibious landings, hunting submarines. Battleship losses that would have crippled any other fleet were absorbed without strategic consequence. Destroyers, cruisers, and aircraft seemed to multiply with every passing month. The Japanese Navy, once confident that its highly trained aviators and superb night-fighting cruisers could dominate the Pacific, suddenly found itself facing an opponent whose industrial engine was so vast that no amount of tactical brilliance could compensate. Terrible, because comprehension brought despair. If the Americans could build 141 carriers, while Japan could barely produce a dozen fleet carriers, and only a fraction were operational at any given time, then the direction of the war was no longer in doubt. No miracle tactic, no audacious sortie, no climactic naval battle could alter mathematics of that scale. The war was lost years before many Japanese leaders were willing to admit it, and thousands of sailors, pilots, and soldiers would perish in a conflict whose outcome had been predetermined not by courage or heritage, but by tonnage, steel, foundries, fuel, factories, and an industrial base capable of achieving what Japan could not even imagine. Historically, navies rise and fall on a complex interplay of doctrine, technology, and strategic vision. But modern war, particularly industrial war, elevates one variable above all others: production. The story of 12 carriers versus 141 carriers is not merely a comparison of ship classes. It is a lesson in the nature of 20th century total war. It illustrates how victory goes not to the most courageous or skilled, but to the side most capable of sustaining, replacing, and expanding its combat power faster than the enemy can destroy it. Japan's early naval strategy had been built on assumptions rooted in pre-industrial or early industrial conflicts. Small elite forces could compensate for numerical inferiority through superior training, discipline, and tactical finesse. This belief drew from the samurai ethos and from the historical success of navies like Britain's, which had dominated the seas through professionalism and seamanship long before the age of mass production. Japanese leaders believed they had created such a navy one that could fight, outnumbered, strike first, and win decisive victories that would shatter American morale and force a negotiated peace. The flaw in that assumption was not in Japan's courage or tactical ability. Both were extraordinary, but in its understanding of American capability and willpower. Japanese naval planners underestimated the industrial potential of the United States, misread its political unity, and failed to grasp how rapidly American society could mobilize once war began. Even after Pearl Harbor, Japanese leaders assumed that American industrial output would be slow to ramp up, encumbered by distance, bureaucracy, and a presumed lack of national resolve. Commander Ohmae and a handful of others warned that these assumptions were dangerously outdated. They understood that once the United States committed to full mobilization, the scale of American shipbuilding would overwhelm anything Japan could produce. But their warnings were ignored or suppressed, overshadowed by a strategic culture more attuned to individual heroism than factory output. The numbers themselves tell the story. Before the war, Japan had one of the most advanced carrier forces in the world. Its pilots were among the best trained anywhere. Its torpedoes, particularly the Type 93 Long Lance, were technologically superior to anything the Americans possessed. Its doctrine emphasized surprise, concentration of force, and aggressive offensive action concepts that would yield spectacular victories in the early months of the war, from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines to the Indian Ocean. Japan entered the conflict believing it could win quickly, before American industry could fully mobilize. But the United States was already mobilizing on a scale that eclipsed even the most pessimistic Japanese assessments. American shipyards expanded at unprecedented rates, converting civilian factories into military production lines and employing millions of workers, including women whose contributions transformed the social landscape. Industrial capacity became a weapon more powerful than any battleship. The United States was launching a new escort carrier every few weeks, sometimes multiple in the same month. Fleet carriers followed, first at a steady pace, then in waves. The Essex class became the backbone of an armada that no other nation could match. Escort carriers, though smaller and slower, filled every gap, providing air cover, hunting submarines, supporting invasions, delivering aircraft. By mid-1944, American naval production was so prolific that new ships were joining the fleet faster than the Japanese could sink them. For Japanese officers like Ohmae, watching this unfold was like witnessing the rising tide against a sandcastle. No matter how valiantly they fought, each loss carried irrecoverable consequences. Losing a carrier meant losing trained pilots, skilled maintenance crews, irreplaceable aircraft, and the cumulative experience of years. Losing pilots was even worse. Japan's training system could not produce replacements fast enough. Each battle that inflicted American casualties inflicted exponentially greater Japanese losses in capability. Meanwhile, the Americans absorbed losses as temporary setbacks. Ships damaged in battle were repaired within months. Air groups replaced lost aircraft with shipments straight from domestic factories. Pilots trained on a scale unimaginable to Japanese instructors. Industrial strength transformed tactical defeats into strategic resilience. This imbalance exposes one of the central truths of modern war. Tactical brilliance cannot compensate for strategic shortages. Courage cannot overcome fuel shortages. Skill cannot replace ships sunk faster than new ones can be built. Boldness cannot repair an aircraft carrier when shipyards are already overstretched. And even the greatest warriors cannot fight effectively without spare parts, ammunition, or reliable supply chains. Japan possessed exceptional sailors and pilots, but they were asked to fight a war designed for a nation far wealthier, larger, and more industrially capable. The story of 12 carriers versus 141 carriers also reveals how dangerously flawed strategic assumptions can be when they are based on incomplete or inaccurate intelligence. Japan's pre-war assessments of American naval strength underestimated the speed at which the United States could expand its fleet. Some estimates assumed that major American shipyards would take years to convert. Others believed that American public opinion would not support a long war. Still, others assumed that American industry, though large, lacked the coordination to mass-produce complex warships quickly. All of these assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. American industrial planning was centralized, streamlined, and extraordinarily efficient. Government agencies coordinated shipyard construction, resource allocation, labor, management, and logistical support. The wartime economy was not merely expanded, it was transformed. The United States did not just increase production, it redefined what industrial production meant. Entire new shipyards emerged where none had existed. Companies that had once built refrigerators and automobiles were suddenly assembling aircraft engines and naval radar sets. This level of mobilization was unlike anything the world had ever seen. For Japan, recognition of this reality came too late. By the time officers like Ohmae fully understood the scale of American production, the war had already locked Japan into a defensive spiral. Every defeat shrank the perimeter of Japanese control. Every loss thinned the ranks of experienced aviators. Every passing month widened the gap between what Japan could produce and what the United States was launching. By 1944, when American fast carrier task forces roamed the Pacific with near impunity, Japanese strategists were forced to contemplate operations in which success depended more on desperate gambles than on coherent strategy. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, often called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, destroyed Japan's naval air arm so thoroughly that its remaining carriers were reduced to decoys in later operations. The Imperial Navy, once the world's most formidable carrier force, had become a hollow shell. And yet, this narrative is not merely about Japan's mistakes or America's strengths. It is a broader reflection on how industrial capacity, properly mobilized and organized, becomes the most decisive weapon in total war. The lesson extends beyond the Pacific, beyond the Second World War, into the very nature of modern conflict. Armies today still rely on production of precision weapons, of aircraft, of drones, of fuel, of ammunition. Logistics remains the foundation of all operations. Nations that cannot sustain long-term production cannot sustain long-term war. History repeatedly shows that wars of attrition are ultimately decided not by who wins the most battles, but by who can replace losses faster and maintain the initiative. This truth is uncomfortable because it diminishes the role of individual heroism and skill qualities that military cultures often exalt. But strategic reality does not bend to romanticism. Courage cannot forge steel. Tenacity cannot build engines. Bravery cannot assemble aircraft carriers. These feats require factories, engineers, labor forces, supply chains, and national coordination. They require political unity and economic planning. They require a society capable of producing not only weapons but spare parts, fuel, food, uniforms, and transport. In total war, the battlefield is merely the final expression of a competition that begins in mines, mills, and machine shops. Returning to Commander Ohmae and officers like him, the tragedy is not only that they understood the war was unwinnable, but that their insight came with the knowledge that nothing could be done to change the trajectory. They could fight harder, plan better, and innovate tactically, but the industrial imbalance was insurmountable. For them, the liberation came from clarity, the terrible part came from inevitability. They were trapped by a nation that had embarked on a war without fully understanding the opponent it provoked. The story of 12 carriers versus 141 carriers is, therefore, not merely a historical anecdote. It is a warning. It shows how nations can misjudge enemies, how strategic planning can be undermined by cultural assumptions, and how even the greatest fighting forces can be rendered ineffective when industrial foundations collapse beneath them. It demonstrates that modern war rewards not the boldest strategy or the bravest warrior, but the most productive, organized, and adaptable nation. And above all, it shows that industrial capacity mobilized intelligently and relentlessly is the ultimate force multiplier, the decisive weapon that determines the duration, intensity, and outcome of total war. In the end, Commander Ohmae's recognition of the numerical imbalance between 12 carriers and 141 was more than a statistic. It was a revelation about the nature of the conflict his nation had chosen, a revelation that came too late, but one whose lessons endure. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.